Tyr to was too. There's not a whole lot of source on Tyr, not from like the direct Norse. I believe he's only mentioned a couple times in the Eddas. Obviously, there's the famous story of the Binding of Fenrir. And then there's when he helps Thor acquire Aegir's brewing pot for the mead. And then, of course, he's in Lokasenna. But other than that, there's not really a whole lot of mention. He's kind of regarded as a god of war, which, as we'll get into, doesn't really define all of Tyr. And like so, we'll go into why. Because he's a lot more than that. And we'll talk about the correlation between him and Mars. Like a lot of these videos, when I talk about deities, I like to go into the origin of the god and talk about the archetypal perspective of that god. And something I've come to realize through this research is that a god seems to be more of an amalgamation of various archetypes. Not too dissimilar from how a person also has those various archetypes, and each culture manifests those archetypes, that archetypal amalgamation, in various different ways depending on what they need, regional differences, perception. Honestly, a multitude of things goes into it. And to say that Tyr is the god of war for the Norse Germanic pantheon would be disingenuous, mostly because every single god has some kind of attachment to war itself, or an aspect of war. So in the Proto-Indo-European origin of Tyr, you get the Sky Father, Deus Peter. Deus, this is actually the origin of deity, and we'll kind of go into how that keeps coming up in every culture. That also seems to be the primary functionality of the archetype of the Sky Father. It's more of a god of balance and order, and then we'll get into that, how that specifically pertains to Tyr's aspect of war. So the source I've been using in a lot of these videos, and I still have no idea how to pronounce his name, Serith, his website, and again, of course, the link will be in the description below. Very, very well researched. Theologically speaking, I disagree with him, but I mean, you can't dispute his research. Very thorough and very interesting. So I'll read the first paragraph here. Deus Peter, the shining sky father, is the most important deity of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. His name is related to Deus. He is the god. It is recognizable in the Roman Jupiter, Oscon Dipter, Umbrian Jupiter, Sabellian Dipoteres, Marusian Lus Petris, Greek Zeus, Zeus Peter, Illyrian De Peturos or De Patro, Vedic Deus Peter, Baltic Divas, Luvian Tatis Tiwes, Palaic Tiaz, Papas, and Germanic Tiwaz, later Tyr. Some of these from the West 2007. Among the Scythians, he was just Papeos' father. The Russian Svarog may be Kalk, since it seems to derive from Iranian origins with a meaning of shining one. Regardless of the Iranian form of the name, the deity is clearly Slavic. In other words, memories and versions of him survived in almost all of the, i.e. Indo-European cultures, which shows how important he was. And as it goes on, he also talks about how Zeus specifically, who is a god of sky, if you're not familiar with the Hellenic mythology, the Greek mythology, your three main deities are Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon. So you have air, underworld, and water. The eldest of the three being Zeus, so he kind of had an impromptu leadership role because he was the eldest. But apparently oaths were sworn to Zeus. And you find in the Norse, there's actually a lot of gods that have oaths sworn to them. Odin does, Oler does, Tiwaz obviously does. Tyr. Var, as a goddess that has oaths sworn to her. Var is actually a probable connection to the Varingar that were the Emperor's Guard of the Byzantine Empire. And Zeus with Themis, and Themis being a goddess of justice and order. She's actually the depiction of justice as we see it here in America. The woman with the scales and the sword and the blindfold, that's Themis. So interestingly enough, all American courthouses, I mean, I can't say all because I haven't ever been to them all, but all that I'm aware of have a depiction of a Greek goddess in their courthouse, which honestly I think is proof that these archetypes, these gods, stay with us. And I'm going to do a video eventually about the symbolism of that and how that's integral to the human psyche, but not that I haven't hinted at with my other videos. But Zeus and Themis gave birth to a goddess of justice and a goddess of order. So you have justice and order literally coming from Zeus and Themis, another goddess of law. And these are all oath gods, right? I went over when I talked about Drengskapr, that the whole oath ring, right? That when you're putting your right hand on the Bible and swearing that oath, that's associated with earlier pagan customs. And I'm probably going to do a video where I research that in depth in the future. One of the world's oldest religions, and a religion that has a lot of their deities are closer to the original Proto-Indo-European, is the Vedic, is Hinduism. But we see that Deus Peter in the Vedic doesn't have necessarily the same qualities of Zeus and Tyr. Oaths aren't really sworn to him. He's more of just a sky father. Him and the earth seem to have procreated and given birth to a lot of different deities. And that's another common theme you see with the sky father. You have a sky father and an earth mother in a lot of these older religions. And of course, in the Norse, we don't have necessarily the same dichotomy. And a lot of the Proto-Indo-European origin has given rise to the idea that Tyr led the pantheon more than Odin did. And there's an interesting theory behind that connection. And we'll go over that as we keep going. And like I was talking about earlier, how the archetypes tend to amalgamate based on the culture. Well, sometimes they split off into various different deities, and sometimes they kind of combine back and forth. Again, it really just depends on the culture and who is interpreting these mental blueprints and how they manifest in us. So it seems like in the Hindu, some of those aspects, more particular with oath and law, have been given to Varuna and Mitra. And if you're at all familiar with the Mithraic cult of Rome, that is associated with Mitra from the Vedic, and even adopted by the Zoroastrians. So there's kind of a correlation there too. So if you're unfamiliar, I've talked about it in previous videos, but Zoroastrianism is a proto-Christianity. It's proto-Abrahamic. That's actually the religion that inspired the Jews to adopt a more monotheistic belief system and created that dualism. In fact, the god that I'm about to talk about, or about to read a description here on Encyclopedia Britannica, is actually another name for their main god, Ahura Mazda. And there's almost a trinity of Ahura Mazda, Varun, which is a variation on Varuna, and Mitra. Varun being the law aspect, and Mitra being the guardian of the sacred realm, essentially. They're like guardian of heaven that keeps the sinners out. So you can kind of see how that has led into some of the later Christian ideas, which in my opinion has obviously been warped, but yeah. So the Encyclopedia Britannica says, Varuna In the Vedic phase of Hindu mythology, the god sovereign, the personification of divine authority. He is the ruler of the sky realm and the upholder of cosmic and moral law, Rita, a duty shared with a group of gods known as the Adityas, see Aditi, of whom he was the chief. He is often jointly invoked with Mitra, who represents the more juridical side of the sovereignty, the alliance between one human being and another, while Varuna represents the magical and speculative aspects, the relationship between gods and human beings. He corresponds closely to Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda. In later Hinduism, Varuna plays a lesser role. He is the guardian of the West and is particularly associated with oceans and waters. Thus, he is often attended by the river goddess Ganga and Yamuna. So you see there that this sky deity is often associated with morality, law, order. And you get that dichotomy often with a lot of various pagan pantheons. I mean, the Egyptian gods, for example, were very much forces of order. Likewise with the Asir. The Asir are very much, the order that quenches the chaos. Hence their conflict with the Otnar, and even to a certain degree the Vanir, who are more natural aspects, more natural archetypes. And I'm going to read the first paragraph in the article on Tyr in Norse Mythology for Smart People. Another really good source. I haven't read his Viking Spirit book, but I really enjoy this website. I think it's very well done. I haven't seen any negative things on here, but Tyr, pronounced like the Old English word Tyr, Old Norse Tyr, Old English Tew, Old High German Zew, Gothic Tis, Proto-Germanic Tiwaz. God is a Norse war god, but also the god who, more than any other, presides over matters of law and justice. His role in the surviving Viking-Age myths is relatively slight, and his status in the later part of the Viking-Age may have been correspondingly minor, but this wasn't always the case. Other kinds of evidence show us that Tyr was one of the most important gods to the Norse and other Germanic people. So the theory on Tyr being a major god in the Germanic pantheon is during the migration period when the German people left from the east and came, more into Europe, and that's when they started kind of clashing with the Romans, and there's a lot more to it than that, but the theory is that Tyr too was a lot more popular then and possibly led the pantheon. And there's no direct evidence of this. It's more like there have been depictions of kind of a sword cult, and then obviously the Proto-Indo-European origins would lead us to think that this Sky Father was more prominent. And then of course you have Tacitus, and that's where we get the largest association with war. So Tacitus associated Tyr specifically with Mars. Mars is essentially the Roman Ares, but there's more to it than that. So Ares for the Greeks is different than Mars for the Romans, and here's where I think a lot of people get kind of confused on Tyr being a god of war, being the god of war, as opposed to a god of part of war, which is kind of true for all of the Norse gods. So Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus were the twin brothers raised by the she-wolf, and eventually they fought. Romulus won and goes on to found Rome. Romulus, Rome, right?
These are Romulans.
That's where we get the name. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of like wolf depictions and wolf cults also associated with Mars. So there's an association there with Fenrir and Tyr. But Mars is more of the ideal man. He's Roman proto-Chad. the Roman ideal, right? He's supposed to be their patriarch. He's supposed to be their progenitor. Ares, on the other hand, in the Greek and the Hellenic tradition, is violent and gets off on that violence, and that is an integral part of who he is.
Ares.
And that's where we get like a major difference between Mars and Ares. So Mars is associated with Tiwaz by Tacitus, whereas Ares is associated with Mars. So associating Ares directly with Tyr doesn't necessarily equate, simply because Tyr doesn't really have that same kind of violent streak, that same lust for battle. He doesn't have that bloodlust. He's more of a god of balance, as you'll see. So the other thing that Tacitus says pertaining to the association with Mars is that Tyr is the progenitor of the German people. So essentially, and we'll go over this a lot more when I do Heimdall. In the Norse lore, Rig, who is probably Heimdall, gave birth to the three classes in Norse society. Well, the sons of Manus gave rise to the Germanic people, and there's three different sons. Not necessarily sure if they're associated with classes per se, but again, we'll dive into that deeper when we go over Heimdall. And Manus's father was Toisto. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. I remember a lot of these names are Romanized versions of their Germanic names. You actually see that a lot in the Celtic, which is really sad because there was a whole genocide thing with the Romans and the ancient Celts and kind of washed over their culture. But that's a soapbox for another day. So it's possible that Toisto is Tew, and that Tacitus is associating Tyr to Mars because Mars is the progenitor of Romulus and Remus, Romulus giving rise to Rome. You draw the conclusions there. So you see, it's probably less a direct association with war itself. The other thing with Mars is he's also a god of agriculture. And according to this blog post that I found, Paleoglot, again, I'll post a link below, and I'm not entirely sure how great this source is. It was fairly hard for me to find sources. I try to find sources that you can click on, and I'll read this paragraph specifically. It's comparing. It's called "Getting the Origins of Mars and Vulcan Right," but here it's saying, as I was doing my daily pursual of Google Books, I came across the Oxford Introduction to Proto-Indo-European and the Proto-Indo-European World with a table of reconstructed Indo-European deities, therein claiming that the theonym Mars may be derived from an Indo-European root Mawart, cf. Sanskrit Marutas, and that the theonym Vulcan may stem from Wikunos. Now, in matters of theory, and one may appeal somewhat to the mysterious unknown, since it can never be known with absolute certainty whether an etymology provided is a correct one. However, we can know with reasonable certainty whether something is incorrect by way of a little bit of old-fashioned deduction. And just to be kind of a stickler, induction would actually be the proper way to go about it. Deduction is starting with a premise. Induction is using evidence to lead you there. Obviously, both have a thing, but induction is the superior way of building evidence to get to a point rather than having a point and using evidence to get there. That's a soapbox for another day. Though we see Mawart may actually be a younger version of this deity, and that could be a reason why he's associated with agriculture, something that Ares is not. So there's a few differences between Ares and Mars, and you can see how Mars and Tyr may be associated. And similar to what the author of this is talking about, really we're just trying to look at the evidence to see kind of where it points. I could be wrong, and if I am, obviously comment and create a discussion. Because that's the only way we can learn, is by throwing opinions out there, right? And debating, civilly, of course. So this is a link that somebody on Twitter sent me. I believe they call themselves the Cult of Tyr. So obviously they have a pretty vested interest in Tyr. And it specifically pertains to Georges Dumizel. He's a French philologist, and he put forth the trifunctional hypothesis, a hypothesis that is actually similar to something that Plato has mentioned. I think he goes a little bit more into specifics, specifically in the sovereign category. And I'll read the first paragraph here, and I'll kind of go over it, and then I'll read the third paragraph because it specifically relates to Dumizel's theory. Tyr is known ostensibly as a god of war. However, the literary texts do not bear this out outside of the final battle at Ragnarok. Tyr never appears on a battlefield, nor do we see any records of warriors going to Tyr after death, as happens with Odin's followers. Instead, Tyr is associated with the Thing, which Simek defines as the legislative and executive assembly of free men in Germanic antiquity. Tyr is often associated with the Roman god Mars, particularly in Tacitus' account, and there is a Mars Thingus image carved on a 3rd century CE altar, Simek 203. So we see there that Tyr is associated with law, and as we go into Dumizel's theory, we'll see that he's just a half of that sovereign aspect of deity. So the paragraph on Dumizel's theory. In Dumizel's theory, there are 3 main categories for deities based on their functions: sovereignty, war, and fecundity. He uses comparative analysis of both Indic and Roman myths to suggest that this tripartite system is an Indo-European remnant, and that the exact parallel of the Scandinavian mythology expressed in the formula Odin Thor Frey may not therefore be an innovation, but a faithfully conserved archaism. If this is the case, some scholars argue Tyr has no place in the system, and this concept is used to point out flaws in Dumizelian theory. Ellis Davison states that in the Viking-Age, they, Odin and Thor, were the dominating figures in the community of gods and goddesses, with Tyr only dimly perceived in the background. The theory, though, is that Odin and Tyr share sovereignty. So Odin is more of the mystical, mystery cult ruler. In modern analogy, you could see that as the priest class, right? So the cleric class, the Gothi, if you will, and the Gothi of the Goldar of the Old Norse. I'm going to link a Hurstwic article specifically on the Thing. It goes into a lot of depth. I actually took a bunch of notes on it, but none of it specifically pertains to this video, other than the Gothi and the Law Speaker, the Goldar and the Law Speaker had kind of a symbiosis of running the Thing, with an Alshiar Gothi being the main person there, because Goldar were also akin to Jarlship, as they were I guess you could consider them like small, almost feudal lords in a sense. Not quite the same as the feudal system that you saw in other parts of Europe. But so Tyr, in that half of sovereignty, is law and order. He is the balance, that law speaker, right? The one that keeps the law, keeps the peace, keeps the balance. And in my theory, that is his aspect of war. Because war, ideally, war is something used to create order. Obviously, that's not always the case, but can be. So Norse Mythology for Smart People also has an article on Dumizel. I'll read the first paragraph here. Georges Dumizel was a 20th century comparative mythologist like Joseph Campbell or Carl Jung, but unlike either of them, he thought that myths could only be properly understood in their original historical context and not as part of a universalistic theory that ignores that context. For that reason, Dumizel chose to focus on analyzing the various Indo-European mythologies and religions in relation to each other, and not in relation to other mythologies or religions outside of that historically linked community. And of course, if you're familiar with my videos, you know that I really enjoy Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, and I think that Georges Dumizel is kind of in that vein of showing that we as human beings have an internal blueprint of the gods, and that's the archetypes, right? Because something you'll see is that Sky Father is something that comes up in a lot of mythologies, including the Pacific Islander cultures like Maori and the Hawaiian. In the Maori, it's Ringa Ninu, and in the Hawaiian, it's Waikia. and I might be pronouncing those wrong. And then, of course, personal favorite of me, of myself, is Tengri. So there's a lot of parallels in Tengrism that correlate to the Norse. Tengrism, which is a religion of the steppe culture, so that's your Mongolian culture, as well as a few surrounding, like the Siberian, as well as some of this. In fact, the word shaman comes from Tengrism, and I've talked about that. It was something that the white European anthropologists of the time appropriated and simply have used for a certain type of spirituality since. But Tengri is the great blue sky.
Every corner of the land beneath this blue sky is ours for the taking.
So, Sky Father, a progenitor of the world, which is another common thing you see with this Sky Father deity. We'll go over more of origin stories and all that when I actually go over like Ymir and the Jotnar. There's an interesting correlation between Ymir and like Kronos, Zeus's father. So there's a whole thing there. Another interesting correlation is that these Sky Fathers, their name is associated with God. And when I say God, I mean big G God. So later on, as these cultures Christianized or Islamized, is that the proper term for that? Muslimized? I'm not sure. But converted to a monotheistic religion, their name got associated with the one God of monotheism. In fact, Tyr in Old Norse is also a generic term for God. In fact, one of the names of Odin is Sigtyr, victory god. I'll read a short little paragraph here on how the Turkic people have used Tengri to associate with Allah. Turkic peoples began to convert to Islam after 750 and in the 10th century. Nearly all of them became Muslim. Long before this, Assyrians invaded Turkestan and made them live close to the border and worship the sun and stars like they did. When dawn breaks, they used to pray by positioning themselves toward the sun. This is why the word Tenyeri, dawn, took the form Tengri, God, later. The dawn was not the god of these Turkic people, but was rather something like the Qibla in Islam. Every day the sunrise was seen as a blessing from God. At times the Republic era, the word Tanri, God, was proposed to be replaced with the word Allah in Turkey, but it failed because it was used to refer to the word God itself. And that you can kind of see there's a progression to using the word Tengri. And I'm not going to read it mostly for time, but I'll throw another link from the New World Encyclopedia on Tengri down in the description as well. There's also an interesting correlation between Old Turkic and the runes that look very similar. No physical evidence whatsoever. There's also no physical evidence of Tengri being associated with Deus Peter. Could be synchronization, which is cultures intermingling. We did know that the Old Norse interacted with the steppe cultures. Interestingly enough, the Scythians, which is a steppe culture, may have also been the Amazons, but that's kind of a soapbox for another day. Yeah, synchronization is when cultures intermingle and kind of share certain things. The shaman of Tengrism actually physically climb a tree. Odin climbs, Yggdrasil metaphorically in the lore. There's just a few different things like that. There's also a wind horse, which is an aspect of the self, which is cultivated in order to climb the tree. There's a lot of different correlations between the two things. There's also the Black Viking, which Arith Harger did a video on. I'll actually put a link in the description of that. It's pretty fascinating. He was considered black because he was of darker skin. But he probably descends from a Mongolian princess that was acquired, I don't know how voluntarily, by, I believe it was an Icelandic jarl or chieftain. And then Attila the Hun is actually in, I believe, later on in the Volsung saga, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of interaction with the steppe cultures. So there may not be necessarily etymological or cultural tradition. It could just very well be that the cultures exchange ideas. But I think there's enough evidence to suggest that having this Sky Father, who is a god of order and who holds oaths, remember, Tyr is associated with the thing, that is a fairly universal archetypal incarnation. So now that we've kind of gone over the history and all that, my personal feelings toward Tyr, not a god that I work with a whole lot, to be honest. I do have a strong sense of justice, and I believe that Tyr is more of a god of justice and balance rather than war itself. I think that war, as we've kind of gone over, isn't necessarily who Tyr is. I think that Mars isn't necessarily a direct, lateral move from Ares over to the Roman. There's just some similarities. And of course, in the Roman, religion was very tied in with the state, which is another huge influence on modern Christianity. But for me, I don't know, my sense of law and order is, I have a strong sense of fairness. And then, so it's kind of interesting, actually. Something that will always happen while I'm preparing to make a video is something in my life will correlate to that and kind of show me almost a lesson that I need to learn. So if you follow me on Reddit at all, you know that I posted in our atheist_paganism, which is one of the subs I mod. Not that I am an atheist, but it's for discussing that and for discussing unorthodox pagan views. And it's a free and open space to talk. I'm not one to create online safe spaces. That for me, that's something you do in real life with your in-group, not online. But I also have been lucky enough to have the freedom to do so, which from discussing online, not a lot of people do. Another hard reality that has hit me in the past few months. Yeah, so I recently posted, talking about the archetypes and really just trying to gauge what people have had to deal with an atheistic or non-theistic or perceived non-theistic, in my case, worldview. Because a lot of these hard polytheists, as soon as you say archetype, they're like atheist, even though it's done not a direct correlation. One could argue that Hindus are both polytheists and believe in archetypes of a sort, and they are both monotheist and they have an interesting worldview, but definitely not an atheist view. Equating the two it's more of a kind of a straw man due to your own projections, which, again, you can tell by my rhetoric what I'm getting into, and that's that my strong sense of justice and fairness is very much, in this specific case, associated with my urge to be understood. Somebody that moved around a lot of first-time introductions with people. Being misperceived was a huge issue, and it's been something I've had to deal with, obviously, in my adult life. So I don't want to use the term offended, because I'm not necessarily offended, but I'm bewildered by the fact that I'm misperceived constantly by these hard polytheists. And I do use the term hard polytheist to distinguish that they believe in separate entities with agency and their own free will, which, free will is debatable, but that's, again, a soapbox for another day. And that's not necessarily an aspect of Tyr. I would actually argue that that's more of an aspect of Fenrir. So Fenrir is more of a god of vengeance and retaliation and retribution. And when we go over Fenrir, we'll go over that more. And I know I haven't talked about Fenrir too much on this one, but that's mostly because it's not necessarily, even though it's one of the larger myths about him, historically, there's not a whole lot of information there. But again, we'll go over that more when we actually do Fenrir. But a hard truth was brought to me. So there's an exercise I do where I will calm my mind and I will have a certain deity or aspect in mind, archetype in mind. I will have a question in mind, and I calm my mind in more of a meditative state, and I try to relax and let the thoughts kind of come, right? So I'm evoking that archetype, that aspect of that deity within myself. I'm evoking it. Tried that with Tyr since I was doing research on Tyr, and nothing came up, just kind of blurry images, and that was it. And then I go ahead and almost put my foot in my mouth to a certain degree, just trying to figure things out. Honestly, that's all I was doing. Most of the time I'm kind of poking the bear to figure things out, and it's not necessarily the best way to go about things, but I'm hard-headed, and sometimes you have to dig deep to figure things out. Anyway, Well, through a lot of introspection and the conversations that came up and a few very good points that people made. As somebody that tries to keep an unbiased, fair mind, I try to take in information that is better than what I have, right? You have to break down your schema in order to have a clear worldview. So all of a sudden, I'm kind of walking around with my son, I'm sort of looking at Reddit, and the words righteous indignation came up in my head. It just popped up. So remember I was talking about how I will relax the mind and let that happen. So what I had seen as me trying to understand something and trying to almost figure out why, because of not really understanding why a community that sees itself separate to myself would distance themselves when I feel like we should have more commonality than that. I guess that's kind of a good way to put it. And it's honestly something weird to me because I haven't really experienced it a lot with the pagan community at large, which for me most of the time has been in real life, not online, which again is a privilege that I have had, as not everyone in the world, and in the United States for that matter, has a free environment to express their religion, which is honestly sad, and I'm kind of mentally trying to think of a way to campaign to, I guess, accept multiple faiths. Who knows, might do a video on that eventually. But yeah, so righteous indignation came up, and I think that was Tyr talking to me, because again, it's not a deity that I work with a whole lot, so having that come to me was not easy. What I thought was a sense of justice turned out to be more of a sense of retribution. I think that's something of Tyr. He's kind of a hard reality. He's a balance that showed me that I needed to, one, kind of distance myself from seeing these people that keep invoking this sense of what the fuck. I don't know a nicer way to put it than kind of tugging at my own beard, wondering what the fuck's going, how. Anyway, but I try to understand. I try to give the other person the benefit of the doubt. I try to understand, because I work under the assumption that I am probably wrong. Obviously, you're not going to walk around with thinking things that are wrong to your knowledge, but I'm always open to new information, or at least try to be. It has to be a sound argument. There's a difference between validity and sound. So, and if something defies your personal schema, that network of thoughts and perceptions that creates your worldview, it's very hard to defy that. So you want to kind of push back. It's really important to kind of relax that and do the research with the intention of becoming better. And so that's been my recent experience with Tyr, which, if you're somebody that works with Fenrir, you're probably not going to have necessarily a great correspondence with Tyr. Yeah, so that's about it. The only other thing I can say necessarily pertaining to Tyr and Fenrir specifically is that Dumizel theorized that the law half of that sovereignty, binding the wolf, gave a more judicial stamp of approval on the binding of Fenrir. And again, we'll explore Fenrir more in his own video. I'm thinking I'll probably do a goddess the next time I do one of these videos, just because I keep doing dudes. I guess I kind of did Ostara a little bit when I was talking about the Ostara blood holiday, but does that really count? I don't know. So yeah, subscribe, comment, do the thing. If you disagree, comment. I'm not going to get better unless I'm tested, unless a better argument is put forth, more information is put forth. I did a crap ton of research on Tyr, which is why it's been, I don't even know how many weeks since putting this out, since my last video. But I know there was a lot on Tyr. He was a pretty important god. I think this video is actually going to be a lot shorter than I thought it was going to be. Oh, another fun fact: the word "law" actually originates from Old Norse. Lagu, written down in my notes, Lagu. So that's kind of an interesting fun fact as well. So remember, the gods are in us all. Skull.